Deep understanding of Judaism and Zionism thanks to Israel Shahak's book, Jewish History, Jewish Religion, following Prejudice and Prevarication, a Totalitarian History. There was, however, one area in which they were not allowed to remain self-contented, the area of Christian attacks against those passages in the Talmud and the Talmudic literature which are specifically anti-Christian or more generally anti-Gentile. It is important to note that this challenge developed relatively late in the history of Christian-Jewish relations, only from the 13th century on. Before that time, the Christian authorities attacked Judaism using either biblical or general arguments, but seemed to be quite ignorant as to the contents of the Talmud. The Christian campaign against the Talmud was apparently brought on by the conversion to Christianity of Jews who were well versed in the Talmud and who were in many cases attracted by the development of Christian philosophy with its strong Aristotelian and thus universal character. Note: the best known cases were in Spain. For example, to use their adopted Christian names, Master Alfonso of Valladolid, converted in 1320, and Paul of Santa Maria, converted in 1390, and appointed Bishop of Burgos in 1415. But many other cases can be cited from all over West Europe. End of note. It must be admitted at the outset that the Talmud and the Talmudic literature, quite apart from the general anti-Gentile streak that runs through them, which will be discussed in greater detail in Chapter 5, contained very offensive statements and precepts directed specifically against Christianity. For example, in addition to a series of scurrilous sexual allegations against Jesus, the Talmud states that his punishment in hell is to be immersed in boiling excrement, a statement not exactly calculated to endear the Talmud to devout Christians. Or one can quote the precept according to which Jews are instructed to burn publicly if possible, any copy of the New Testament that comes into their hands. This is not only still in force, but actually practiced today. Thus, on March the 23rd of the year 1980, hundreds of copies of the New Testament were publicly and ceremonially burnt in Jerusalem under the auspices of Yad Leachim, a Jewish religious organization subsidized by the Israeli Ministry of Religions. Anyway, a powerful attack, well based in many points, against Talmudic Judaism developed in Europe from the 13th century. We are not referring here to ignorant calumnies, such as the blood libel propagated by benighted monks in small provincial cities, but to serious disputations held before the best European universities of the time, and on the whole conducted as fairly as was possible under medieval circumstances. Note: certainly, the tone and also the consequences were very much better than in disputations in which Christians were accused of heresy. For example, those in which Peter Abelard or the strict Franciscans were condemned. End of note. What was the Jewish, or rather the rabbinical, response? The simplest one was the ancient weapon of bribery and string pulling. In most European countries, during most of the time, anything could be fixed by a bribe. Nowhere was this maxim more true than in the Rome of the Renaissance popes. The Editio Princeps of the complete code of Talmudic law, Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, replete not only with the most offensive precepts against all Gentiles, but also with explicit attacks on Christianity and on Jesus, after whose name the author adds piously, may the name of the wicked perish, was published unexpurgated in Rome in the year 1480 under Sixtus IV, politically a very active pope who had a constant and urgent need for money. A few years earlier, the only older edition of the Golden Ass by Apuleius, from which the violent attack on Christianity had not been removed, was also published in Rome. Alexander VI, Borgia, was also very liberal in this respect. Even during that period, as well as before it, there were always countries in which, for a time, a wave of anti-Talmud persecution set in. But a more consistent and widespread onslaught came with the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, which induced a higher standard of intellectual honesty, as well as a better knowledge of Hebrew among Christian scholars. From the 16th century, all the Talmudic literature, including the Talmud itself, was subjected to Christian censorship in various countries. In Russia, this went on until 1917. Some censors, such as in Holland, were more lax, while others were more severe, and the offensive passages were expunged or modified. All modern studies on Judaism, particularly by Jews, have evolved from that conflict, and to this day they bear the unmistakable marks of their origin: deception, apologetics, or hostile polemics, indifference, or even active hostility to the pursuit of truth. Almost all the so-called Jewish studies in Judaism, from that time to this very day, are polemics against an external enemy rather than an internal debate. It is important to note that this was initially the character of historiography in all known societies, except ancient Greece, whose early liberal historians were attacked by later sophists for their insufficient patriotism. This was true of the early Catholic and Protestant historians, who polemicized against each other. Similarly, the earliest European national histories are imbued with the crudest nationalism and scorn for all other neighboring nations. But sooner or later, there comes a time when an attempt is made to understand one's national or religious adversary, and at the same time to criticize certain deep and important aspects of the history of one's own group. And both these developments go together. Only when historiography becomes, as Peter Gell put it so well, a debate without end, rather than a continuation of war by historiographic means, only then does a human historiography, which strives for both accuracy and fairness, become possible. And it then turns into one of the most powerful instruments of humanism and self-education. It is for this reason that modern totalitarian regimes rewrite history or punish historians. Note: the Stalinist and Chinese examples are sufficiently well known. However, it is worth mentioning that the persecution of honest historians in Germany began very early. In 1874, H. Ewald, a professor at Göttingen, was imprisoned for expressing incorrect views on the conquests of Frederick II 100 years earlier. The situation in Israel is analogous. The worst attacks against me were provoked not by the violent terms I employ in my condemnations of Zionism and the oppression of Palestinians, but by an early article of mine about the role of Jews in the slave trade, in which the latest case quoted dated from 1870. That article was published before the 1977 war. Nowadays, its publication would be impossible. End of note. When a whole society tries to return to totalitarianism, a totalitarian history is written, not because of compulsion from above, but under pressure from below, which is much more effective. This is what happened in Jewish history, and this constitutes the first obstacle we have to surmount.